And now on the line is Caoimhe de Barra. Caoimhe is the CEO of Trócaire. Caoimhe, welcome back to Near FM.
Very nice to speak with you. Thank you for having me.
Okay, I didn't plan this, Caoimhe, but today is actually 1 year to the day since our last interview on Near FM. In our last interview last year, we spoke about the famine food crisis in the Horn of Africa. As it has been a year since our last interview where we spoke about the Horn of Africa, Caoimhe, can you give our listeners today on Near FM a bit of a summary of how the situation in the region has changed over the last year? Like, or in other words, like, is there any good news coming out of the region?
Of course, Darren, and thank you very much for that question, because often we forget to go back and to discuss what happened after maybe a crisis has peaked. So famine was averted in Somalia in 2022, but only just. The reality is that 43,000 people died last year alone as a result of drought in Somalia. The drought was very, very prolonged. So even by the standards of Somalia, which would, relatively frequently have suffered some drought over the years, what happened in Somalia was that there were 5 failed consecutive rainy seasons. So there's 2 rainy seasons a year. So for nearly 3 years, there was no rainfall. So if you can imagine here in Ireland, communities that are involved in agriculture, if there was a failed harvest 5 years in a row, it would be absolutely devastating. So we had a good rainy season just very recently. So people have started to be able to recover. But that's in a context where millions of people were displaced, 4 million livestock were lost. So people are really starting from an absolute zero base to rebuild their lives. Some people lost family, some children in particular were extremely vulnerable. People moved, lost their homes. Young girls often, had to enter into early marriage, left education. So the reality is that Somalia is on a long, long path to recovery and really still needs our solidarity and our support. And especially in a context where climate change is really driving more frequent droughts and floods as well, and where there's ongoing conflict. So I think it's very important that you ask the question, because we don't want Somalia to become another forgotten emergency that only surfaces in terms of global attention when there's another famine. So I think if we can invest in prevention of poverty in Somalia, supporting people to rebuild their livelihoods, to do so on the basis that we know that climate change is going to continue to have an impact. So how can we support people to be able to be ready for climate change? Then I think we can prevent a crisis of that nature happening again. But it really requires an awful lot of attention and investment from the global community.
Okay, I'm delighted to hear that there was a famine averted last year. I'll come back to you on Near FM again to talk about Somalia again, okay? Okay,
Great.
okay, Caoimhe, the main thing that inspired me to get in touch with you for today for this interview is that your organisation Trócaire is 50 years old this year. This is a big question, Caoimhe, but can you tell me or give me a bit of a summary about the history and evolution of Trócaire over the last 50 years?
Sure, I'll try and do that as briefly as I can without losing too much of the really valuable information that I could give you. So Trócaire was established in 1973, and at that time, as people will know, Ireland was just on the verge of joining the European Union, the European Economic Community as it was at the time, and was a country that was itself just kind of recovering from some very difficult decades of emigration and a lack of development. But Trócaire was established at a time when people were also seeing for the first time humanitarian emergencies on their television screens. So there'd been the conflict in Biafra in Nigeria, and then one of the sparks for the establishment of Trócaire were floods in Bangladesh, and the fact that people were becoming more and more aware of these through the television helped people to prompt the Catholic Church in Ireland, literally through talking to their parish priests and saying, we have to do something about this, to establish Trócaire. But Trócaire was established not only to respond to humanitarian crises and to people living in poverty and their immediate needs, but to respond to the drivers of those crises. So to look at, well, what was causing poverty, what was causing humanitarian emergencies, and looking through a justice lens. So working on issues such as human rights, working on issues such as democracy, people's ability to voice out and hold accountable their own governments. So, for example, in the 70s and the 80s, Trócaire was very active in communities in countries such as South Africa and in Central America, where we were supporting people both with basic livelihood strategies to reduce poverty and get children in school and address health, but also working with community organizations who are building democracy from the grassroots up. So, people coming together, understanding that as a group, as a community, that, it wasn't right for them not to have voice or a vote or the power to affect decisions over their own lives. So helping people to organise from the community level up. And this would have been with very local organisations, partner organisations of Trócaire's, sometimes with missionary organisations, so organisations that were working in very rural areas with people very marginalised, and helping them to understand that actually they could transform their own communities through their own agency. By the time we got to the 90s, or the late 80s and the 90s, there were a number of huge events in the world that many listeners will remember. So, for example, the famines in Ethiopia and in Somalia, the awful genocide in Rwanda in the early 90s. There was also famine in North Korea later in the 90s. So Trócaire at that point was both continuing with its grassroots justice work, but also responding at greater and greater scale to humanitarian emergencies. And again, responding through local partners all the time, strongly believing that local organisations are best placed to respond to the issues affecting their communities. In some cases, following those major emergencies, like in Rwanda, countries had to essentially rebuild everything. So in Rwanda, Trócaire worked both in terms of helping people to rebuild their lives, their homes, their houses, access land. Everything had been wiped away for many people, but also dealing with things like the trauma of the genocide. And that work, to be honest, continues to this very day, because even though so many years have passed, people are still affected by the residual impact of that trauma. And then in other countries, so Somalia effectively collapsed as a state, and there was no central state for many, many years. So Trócaire was at the heart of the health system, and remains at the heart of the health system in a district in Somalia, which is the size of the island of Ireland. And we've managed to remain there in spite of 30 years of active conflict. And we remain there because the community is strongly supportive of Trócaire, wants us there, and enables our presence. And our presence is very much a support presence. We enable local communities to deliver services by providing technical support and obviously financial support. By the time we reached the 2000s, in many ways it was almost a golden era for development. There had been the major campaigns to drop the debt. Trócaire was very involved in those campaigns on trade justice. So we were seeing a sort of, the groundswell of public mobilisation, both in the global north and the global south, actually delivering results. So there was policy change at an international level. Poverty, the basic statistics on poverty started going in the right direction. And for 20 years, poverty was reduced overall, right up until the time when we hit COVID. And unfortunately, the COVID crisis has had a lasting impact. It's really driven some of the poverty indicators backwards. But nonetheless, we know after 20 years of progress that we can recover with the right investments. And I think right now, so we're operating in an environment where we've got the Sustainable Development Goals, which are essential. They're goals that are global in nature around reducing poverty, increasing equality and voice and participation in every country in the world by 2030. It's absolutely critical that climate change goals are also met, or we will not meet poverty reduction goals. So Trócaire at the moment is heavily focused on climate as an issue, also on conflict, and on supporting people in the world's most fragile countries to navigate the day-to-day challenges that they experience, while we're also supporting them and their organisations and their leaders to address issues of global justice.
Okay, that's a great summary, Caoimhe. I just have a couple more questions for our Asperla interview. I know you're a Catholic Christian organisation. I remember interviewing someone from Christian Aid a long time ago, and he told me that you do not actually have to be an official Christian to work for their organisation. Are Trócaire the same in that regard, Caoimhe, in that every individual working for you is different and doesn't have to follow any particular religion?
Yes, that is absolutely the case. So there's no requirement to be a Catholic to work in Trócaire. In fact, of our 460 employees, it's quite possible that people who identify as Christians may well be in the minority, because we work in countries where, there's a large Muslim population. We work in countries like Myanmar, where people are predominantly Buddhist. But even here in Ireland, we have a very diverse group of staff, and we welcome everybody of all faiths and none to join us in Trócaire. We do not tolerate discrimination on any grounds. People in Ireland will be familiar with the 9 grounds of discrimination, so stretching right across gender, gender identity, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, membership of minority groups. We don't tolerate discrimination on any of those bases. We welcome everybody. In fact, we really encourage more diversity in our organisation, because we strongly believe that the more diverse our workforce is from a whole range of perspectives, the stronger we will be, the better our decisions will be, because the more inclusive the perspectives will be. So no, there's absolutely no requirement to be Catholic. Of course, we expect everybody to understand the values that underpin Trócaire and to adhere to them, and to adhere to our code of conduct, which is rooted in those values. But that is something which you would expect to see in any organisation, certainly any organisation in the charity sector.
Okay, that's cool. Okay, you had a big conference on Friday the 8th of this month to mark our anniversary, didn't you? Can you tell me more about that, Caoimhe?
Certainly, this was quite an important event for us, and it was an event where we were both looking back over lessons that we've learned over the past 50 years and looking forward. And we identified 2, perhaps 3 major themes to focus on, themes that we feel are really threatening the environments within which we work. So the first is climate change, and I suppose this is very obvious to everybody. The people who are least responsible for carbon emissions, so least responsible for the damage being done by climate change, are most affected by it. So communities in countries like Malawi or Sierra Leone or Somalia, their carbon emissions are a fraction of what Ireland's are, and a minuscule fraction of what European Union's are, for example, but they are suffering much more intense and frequent floods, droughts and cyclones, and we're seeing massive damage being done to people's lives as a result. So we were focusing on, well, how can we both advocate for a fairer approach to climate change? So, for example, at the COP that's happening in December of this year, how can we ensure that countries commit to greater reduction of emissions, but also greater climate finance? That was a major theme. And then the second major theme was around the space that organisations have to do their legitimate work as NGOs. And in many of the countries in which we work, we're finding that the contexts are getting more and more difficult. It's more and more difficult, for example, for humanitarian organisations to travel safely to reach communities that are maybe in conflict-affected areas. It's more and more difficult for organisations that are speaking out about the violation of rights of communities, for example, to do that safely. Trócaire's partner organisations are facing greater and greater constraints in terms of the freedom to do their legitimate, peaceful work. So we were discussing what are the issues around that, and then how can they be constructively addressed. And we get huge support from the Irish government in particular, because their global foreign policy is very much rooted in the concepts around democracy and freedoms. So we had good, strong discussions about how best we, both as the NGO sector, but with the Irish government, can support and defend those basic freedoms. So they were really the driving themes in our conference, and we're also looking ahead as to how we can ensure that our work is strongly supportive of communities affected by those issues.
Okay, Caoimhe, to come towards the end of our Osprey interview, you maybe have already just answered this question, but somewhat. But going forward over the next few years, can you tell me the countries and areas that Trócaire will be prioritising in your work overseas?
So we will be continuing to prioritise the countries that are most fragile. So those countries are often conflict affected, but they're also countries that are affected by climate change. So we'll continue to focus on countries in East Africa, Southern Africa, West Africa, in the Middle East and in Central America. And we'll be working with local communities, with local organisations to help them prevent the damaging impact of climate change. We'll also be working on issues around, as I mentioned, around ensuring that civil society organisations have a safe space to operate in, whether they're working on, gender equality issues or many other issues. So we'll be driving that forward. And we continue to operate in cooperation with many other organisations, which is one of the strengths of our sector. So we look forward to further collaboration within the global and national networks that we have, so we can achieve greater change together over time.
Initiar an lína tá Caoimhe de Barra príomh-Fhómhair Trócaire, a Caoimhe fáilte rascaidíon clár?
Gur míle mágad.
A Caoimhe hui méid deagháil leat chun an taglamh seo a dhéanamh inniu de bhar go bhfuil Trócaire 5 bliain ar an bhfólam lína. Is ceismhóirí seo ach an féidir leat acu a thuairt faoi stair agus dul chun céin Trócaire thar de blianta líon 1973 go dtí an lá atá inniu ann Caoimhe?
Kinte van ansosta sin dhéanamh. So is stocha mar is ól buníú Trócaire sa bhliain 1973 agus is tír an dhifriúil bhí éireann gan am sin agus bhí mar dúirt ar tí fáilisteachinn san Aontas Eorpach ach ag an am céine is stocha bhí daoine bhí gachar de dulchan cín an deochan éireann agus bhí sais is ag daoine go raibh éireann ag dul a bheabhas bhí an tír ag éirí stocha níos sevra ach ag an am céine tuis go raibh telefís ignis ag an am sin in san furmhór is na tithe bhí níos mó ólas ag daoine mar dhealar na tubaistí móra bhí a titim amach mór himpel an domhan mar hampla na tilta móra bhí a tharla in san bhliain sin 1973 i Bangladesh agus tuis gan ólas seo a bheith ar daoine bhí sais éile bhain ag ar aglas na haireann níos mó dhéanamh mar dhealar so sin an fógur bunaíú Trócaire here is a bhliain 1973 agus ins na 70 agus na 80 bhí mar a gobar godílis ar cuasaí mar dhealar an Bochtaineacht agus nuair a bhuniú Trócaire dúirt an taglis Catalach look teir agus bí ag duling leis an Bochtaineacht agus tionchar an Bochtaineacht ar dhaoine a chomála sin bígí ag chur an ceist cén fáil an Bochtaineacht dain cén fá a bhfuil tubaistí a titim amach agus bí a déanamh agóid mar dhealar na cuasaí sin. So bhí Trócaire an gnóthacht mar hampla mar dhealar an Africas agus séir bhí titim amach sin faoi bhain in apartheid an cinnaíthú bhí mar déanamh annach chuid oibre ar America Lórnach áit a raibh conspóid córach agus bhí daoine híos leis ó thaobh nasáis faiban a polatúla bhí a torlú sa titim amachchan sin. So bhí Trócaire ag obair le agraíochtaí an áitiúil, agraíochtaí beaga de daoine áitiúla a bhí ag géirí ní hamháin duling le Bochtaineacht a chomá lei sin bheithan an den lás a thuirt arás chuna hiortha féin. Faoin am gur chruithmuid na 80 na 90 bhí tubaistí móra torlú mór himpel an dan mar hampla beidir gur go daoine ar an gcuirta mór in san Éiseop agus in san is Somália chomá in san 80 90 agus an cinnaíthú i Rwanda. So bhí Trócaire cé gur mar fósa leanúint linn leis an obair mar dhealar Bochtaineacht i dtíorthaí bhí beagáí níos stocha nach raibh na tubaistí sin a titim amach nó raibh dulchan cín a torlú mar hampla an Africas. Bhí mar dul le tubaistí ulmhóra, gurta ulmhór, tubaist cosúla an cinnaíthú Rwanda. So is obair ionntach mór bhí a gceist an sin agus bhfuair mar antacaíocht ó muintir na haireann. Faoin am gur tharla is tócha gur tháinig chuig deire an centenary sin agus bhí mar isteach in sna céad blianta den 50 bliain ó hin. Thosa mar feiscid go raibh dulchan cín a torlú, dulchan cín ansolar a torlú ó thaobh Bochtaineacht a laidú mar himpel na cuine agus bhí sin an sósúil ar fad. Ach de réir mar a ghuiidmuid dro na blianta tá titim amach leir na chóra bhí si níos soléir gur gá aid mór in san dan agus bhí sin arthú aráide agus corachas covalent agus tuisc arthú aráide thosaí mar a feiscint 50 nó beidir 50 bliain ó hin an bailachan ruise seo dul i bhaim ar daoine a dtíortha i méil ferbertha agus tá sé sin tríd ar níos meas agus níos meas réir chéile agus an rud céine le córach agus covalent annachad dus na tíre ina bhfuil muid ag obair is í sin cean dus na faibanna is mó atá agin ó thaobh leanúnachas a bheith hán leis an obair a bhfuil dhéanamh ar an dalamh le pobal áitiúil agus chomá lei sin just daoine a chosint ó tionchar córaach. So Caoimhe rá like tréis chuig go blian is féidir an brand sér agus feis an ghfuil andulch an cín dente ins na tíre agus leis na pobl in a bhfuilmuid tréis a bheith gobar agus chomáile sin ar fud an dain ach Caoimhe súlach mad ar na stocha na rudí móra cosúla ar thuairóid tuis gur bhfuil sé bagart agus ag chur brú ar an dulch an cín sin.
Okay. Cé go fara is atá tú go pásan ag obair le Trócaire agus san airnáil ag cuitin a Caoimhe?
Well, ceist mórí sin, so thusa mé gobar san airnáil beidir trocha blian ó hin, agus tá mé le Trócaire le ó blian de fád a thusa mé Trócaire sa bblion 1997 agus bhí me le Trócaire ar fa 8 blian 10, sin dóg mé agus cha mé cúpla blian in Malawi in Eisceart na Hafraice ag gobar le concern, agus tháinig mé ras go Trócaire. So tá se stocha achar fád a golóir caite agam I Trócaire agus in san airnáil.
Okay, an bhain tú go pásan ag Caoimhe agus ó cóglacha a Trócaire oibríon thar mór an taitnamh as for gúid oibre thar just mar tá explainamh mar ar thaobh amháin tigram go bhfuil an lán I dúrchas an ó thaobh like a lán daoine ag fáil bás go tráideoideach roiint áit an timp na crunne?
Is stocha ní hé bhfuil an obréisce ar churbe agus annach chuid den an bín se dachar mar táid ag mar hapla leir na chóra táid ag breanúhar catá téit amach I Morocco agus I Libya agus an rud a thugann sásachtún ní an gur tanmhatáin ach sásachtún ná go bhfuil mar an an dulling le leis na feibanna sin go bhfuil mar an an cabhar thuirt a riine inám éigeandála agus nuair táid a gobar ar bhean níos fuide táid an dulcham cíine eiscint a Gordaine agus na daine is lochalí ar dain iad na daine ghfuil muidne ag oberló so ní hé ggóil an ober gcónaí tanmhach tá sé orintanta ach tá sé is minic go mín sé sásúil agus go bhfuin muid an spreaga ón misneach atá ag ar partner ar go-40 áitiúla is siúd ggóil muid takeúló agus fan muid an misneach agus an spreaga as an ober dhéanann siad sin agus as an misneach agus gachad dhéanann siad chun cabhrú leis na pobl an pobl umláin ina ddíre hain chuirn sin an sás a bheirin.
Okay, bhí cóná a gcuimh an teachant caite ar an 8ú lá a Caoimhe an féidir na níos mó ólas a thuirstom faoi?
Cinnta so tar éis chuig blian ar an bhód bhí mar a ggéir breanú siar agus feiscint bhfuil cad tá fálamtha agin agus breanúch an tosaigh chomá agus feiscint bhfuil cadíad an rudí móra tá amach roin cadíad na stocha an rudí ismó gur gáúin bheith ag díú ar order thu anas gur féidirlín an fios ismó a chur an bhainse. So bhí mar feiscint stocha ar arhuaráide mar isol de gachéine is tá tionchar iontoch mór ag ahrúaróide ar na daoine is buchte ar dain agus is uásach an rudé agus tá sé anmí chóir amachsamach tus go bíd na daoine is buchte ar dain is mó a híos leis is mó a ulangíon ó ahrúaróide agus is lú is cis le ahrúaróide. So bhí mar ranhir bhfuil cadíon rudí go leir gur féidirlín dhéanamh mar jouler sin agus istachan sin measc istachan sin ní hamháin na rudí gur féidirlín bheith freagrúch asú ar an dálah vins na tíre inhfuil muid gobar den ar go-40 áitiúla a chomáile sin cad é an brú gur féidirlín chur ar rialtas na Heorpa ar rialtas na Héireann ar na rialtas go léir ar san dain umláin ó heh ó heh emissions a laidú agus ó heh anáis an na hacuí a chuirt den na tíre is mó a híos leis ó heh ahrúaróide chun gur féidir lo iad féin a chusant ó tion chur ahrúaróide a machchanse. So sin téim an bhór a bhí ó plé agan an seachtain se chaite agus reinintá téime eile mar jouler an spás atá agin mar agriochttaí carthanachta dul ag gobar agus leanúint leis an obair agus cabhra chuirt lenar go-fortathe obair leanúnach a dhéanamh I ddíorthaí atá I gcuimhlint I ddíorthaí atá beidir faoi smacht rialtas nachhfuil cho stocha oscailta lenar rialtas hain. So mar dulling le leis na ceistena sin chomá.
Okay, sin go héintach. Okay, a Caoimhe chun seachtarrá ggéar an agalah an bhfuil éon fleanan nó áirithe móra a sa bhreis a blanáil a gcuimh a Trócaire duna blianta atá amachrán ar bhaid leat a intin dar lucht éisteachta fuhu?
Ben mi de leanúnt ag déanamh annachchuid obair ar ahrúaróide, mar is é sin ceandas na rudí ismó atá ag dul bhaim ar na dtíine go mu gobar lo in na tíorthaí is locally ar fud an down. So massam héin go mu chun an líon aibre sin a bhéidú amachchan seo agus ní hamháin an obair ar an dalamh a chomáile sin an obair ó héamh idechas a chur a roioine an seán éireann mar gheall an tionchhartá aige ar tíortha eile agus ag iarr daoine bhfuil teachtlinn in reintas an obair dhéanam muid ar a level politúil mar gheall ar ahrúaróide. Agus so leanúid lei sin agus an príomhhaimime agadíine lá leanúint linn na ceú le na agriochtaí áitiúla ar go fortathe in a obair sin atá cho crógach agus go misneach sin agus misnúil sin agus ceú lo an tionchar mór atá acu a bheith hacu ar fe blianta fada, mar is gá leis is fóstach an rud é gohfuil an méid sin cuimhlint agus géirchéim haar fud an dain ach tá mid trééis feiscin gur féidirlinn difriúla dhéanamh difriocht a dhéanamh agus tá mid gur difriocht is mó gur féidirlinn a dhéanamh amachchanse le carmhaint an héireann.